Well, there have been some high-profile strikes lately. Air Canada flight attendants recently brought flights to a grinding halt, defying a government back-to-work order. Canada Post negotiations for a new collective agreement have been ongoing for more than a year and a half. Today, we'll talk about what this and other job actions mean for the current labor movement. We'll also take the pulse of Saskatchewan unions, and we'll talk to a labor expert about where gains still need to be made in the fight for workers' rights in this country. Do you have an experience with a union, or are you trying to unionize? Get in touch. Call 1-800-716-2221 or email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, teachers across the province are welcoming back students today. It is a much different mood than it has been in recent years when job action was looming, as is the case in Alberta right now. Samantha Beacott is the president of the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, and she joins us right now. Hi there, Samantha.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here on such a busy day. How are you feeling heading into the school year?
Well, there's definitely some excitement. I know teachers as well have a little bit of nerves at the start of the year, just like their students. But knowing that there's going to be an additional 500 teachers in our classrooms, thanks to the actions that teachers took, as well as the support that we received from the public, gives us a little bit of hope that we'll be a little better equipped to meet the needs of our students, but also recognizing that this isn't going to solve all of the problems, and we still need to see continued investment from our government to ensure that students are well supported.
Let's dig into that a little bit. What are some of the changes that you negotiated in the contract that you'll be seeing implemented this year?
So the biggest one that's going to impact classrooms is around classroom complexity, which is something that we've been talking about for a number of years, but most recently in the last kind of 2 to 3, where it's become really public and parents have really started to understand the challenges that we're experiencing. We were able, through arbitration, to have a decision be awarded to us to have class complexity included as its own article. And within that article brings 500 additional teachers, depending on the size of the school. There will be either a full-time teacher or a half-time teacher allocated to schools. Unfortunately, really small schools aren't going to receive additional supports through that clause, but there's an additional class complexity fund with $20 million where school divisions, along with the local association, are able to determine where those funds can be used best, maybe in the smallest schools in the division, or maybe potentially to help out with other challenges that they're seeing across their divisions.
And what do you think will make the biggest difference for the experience of teachers and students, Samantha? Do you think it is having those complexity teachers?
Well, I think the flexibility of the class complexity teacher is really what's key. We are a large province, and there's a lot of diversity across the province in terms of the needs of our students. And so the class complexity teacher is going to be assigned duties through collaboration with the school division, the principal, and the staff within the school. And really, those frontline staff are the ones who know their students best and know what needs need to be met and what supports are needed in order to ensure student success. Again, like I said, though, this isn't going to solve all of the problems. Just like we have a large province and there's a lot of diversity of needs, the same is true when we're looking within schools. There's a lot of diversity of needs, and that's really what's been the biggest challenge with classroom complexity, is that a single teacher can't meet all of the needs of all of the students, especially when class sizes are growing and those needs are becoming more complex. So class complexity teacher will help alleviate some of the challenges that we're seeing in schools, but it's not a solution, but it is definitely a great first step.
The Fraser Institute recently put out a new report on how much provinces are spending on students, and it shows a decline in spending per student in Saskatchewan. What do you think is the significance of that?
Well, it really just confirms everything that we've been saying for the last decade here in Saskatchewan. We've been talking about underfunding in education and chronic underfunding. So Saskatchewan, out of all of the provinces in Canada, saw the second largest drop in inflation-adjusted per student spending. The only one to see a larger drop in that inflation-adjusted spending was Alberta. And here in Saskatchewan, we saw a 15% reduction. Thankfully, though, because of the actions that teachers took, all of the advocacy that the public had, all of those conversations from parents to their MLAs, we did see last year in the budget, this year in our budget in 2025, finally see an increase in that per student funding. But we know it's going to take longer than just 1 year to fix that decade of chronic underfunding. And so we need to see the government continue in future budgets to provide that high investment in our students so that they can be successful in their schools and we can start to get back to the level of supports that we saw in schools back in 2012 or 2015.
You mentioned Alberta really briefly there, and there is a looming teachers' strike in Alberta right now. How closely do you work with your counterparts in other provinces? Are they asking you for advice?
Well, we are definitely here to support our colleagues across the country. We, STF, as well as the Alberta Teachers Association, are members of the Canadian Teachers Federation, and we work collaboratively in whatever way we can, whether it's around bargaining or around other ways of how we can support teachers so that our members can better support their students. So we're absolutely having conversations, and we're here to support them in whatever way that they need or would like to see. And I just send my solidarity to them because I know too that, as I said, they had the largest decrease in per student spending or per student funding, and Saskatchewan is pretty close to them. And we want what's best for kids, and that it doesn't matter if it's just in this province or in Alberta or across the country. All students in Canada deserve to have a high quality education.
And when does your next round of bargaining begin, Samantha?
So our current agreement that we just had signed earlier in the spring of this year, unfortunately took us about 2 years to negotiate. It's only a 3-year term, so it will come due at the end of August of 2026. We'll be back at the bargaining table in May this school year.
And how are you feeling about that?
Excited. I mean, like I said, this Article 17, our cost complexity article, and the inclusion of 500 additional teachers is just a first step. So going back to the bargaining table just means that we have another opportunity to provide more improvements for students and teachers in their classrooms across our province.
Are you optimistic going into that? It's not that far off.
Always optimistic. I'm hopeful that we can go back to the table with renewed relationships and a renewed commitment to have good faith conversations to try and make sure that we're providing the best education system here in Saskatchewan for our students, and then in turn supporting the teachers in the schools. We know as well that there's a recruitment and retention issue across Canada. We need to make sure that we're doing what we can here in Saskatchewan to make sure we're recruiting the best and keeping them in the classroom.
Samantha, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
I'm Candice Lipsky. You are listening to Blue Sky on CBC Radio 1. I was just speaking with Samantha Beacott. She is the president of the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. Today on the show, we're talking a little bit about what's driving this era of labor action and what it means for workers and employers alike. We'd love for you to weigh in. Have you been part of union action recently? What changes have you been seeing in your workplace over the past few years? Maybe you've been on strike and you have a story to tell us about it. You can get in touch by calling 1-800-716-2221 or emailing bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, we have two guests with us for the remainder of the show. Lori Jobe is president of the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor. She is in our Regina studio. Hi, Lori.
Hello.
And Charles Smith teaches politics at St. Thomas More College at the U of S and is also an expert in labor issues. And he's with me right now in our Saskatoon studio. Hi, Charles.
Hey, Candice. Hi, Lori.
So you were both listening to that interview with Samantha Beacott from the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation. Charles, let's start with you. What stood out to you there?
I mean, I think, one of the things we're seeing in the Canadian labor movement right now is that the face of Canadian labor is shifting. It's younger. It's more dominated by women. The majority of union members in Canada today are in the public sector, and I think Samantha Beacott represents that clearly. And you're seeing issues of workplaces that are dominated by women workers for the most part. So I think that's a good example of the face of the modern Canadian labor movement. I talk to my students and I ask them to close their eyes and say, well, what do you think of when you think of a unionized worker? And a lot of them will say, well, a hard hat and steel-toe boots. And that's certainly part of it, but it's actually way more dominated by public sector women workers, nurses, teachers, and so forth. So I think it really reflects the face of the modern labor movement.
Interesting. And flight attendants, too, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Absolutely.
But Lori, what about you? What stood out to you from that conversation?
Well, I think the way that Samantha just talked about the work that went into achieving the collective agreement that they were able to win, the months and years of preparation, of campaigning, of educating not only the public but parents and their members alike about the issues and about how to talk to them, and that collaborative approach. That they just dealt with facts. They heard the voices of the parents, of the students, and they know exactly how the teachers are feeling. And I think the way they took their time and got their message across was very effective.
I do want to talk a little bit about the recent Air Canada strike because I think it's so fresh in our memory. I know it impacted people who are sitting right here in this room with me. Air Canada flight attendants, of course, defied federal intervention meant to halt their strike, which I think I wasn't necessarily expecting. Did it surprise you, Lori?
Not particularly. I think it was just a matter of time where we saw a union, a national union, stand up and say, no, this is enough. The unfairness has gone on for too long. And I think CUPE was in the position to do that. And so I think they stood up not only for flight attendants that are CUPE members, but they stood up for all working people in our country. And it was a proud moment for workers in Canada.
Charles, you were impacted by the strike, weren't you?
Yeah, we were stuck in Toronto for about an extra week, but that's okay. Toronto's a great city, so it was fine to be stuck there.
So as a labor expert, though, what were you thinking about during your extra week in Toronto?
Lots of different things, right? I mean, I think one of the things we've seen, and this has been true historically in Canada, is that the governments, especially at the federal level, are very quick to end workers' rights to strike. And we've seen that repeatedly since at least the 1970s, if not sooner. The Liberals found a new kind of innovative, I would say innovative in quotation marks, way to avoid using legislation to end strikes, and they were doing this Section 107 Section 107 of the Labor Code, which is kind of a backdoor approach to back-to-work legislation, but without having to actually put a bill before Parliament. And what became clear, I think it was 8 times used against various federal workers, is that the Liberals were going to use this as a way to avoid the employer and the union having hard discussions at the bargaining table. And Air Canada admitted as much. They've been on record saying, we expected the government to introduce Section 107. We didn't expect the unions to defy that. And when the union did, the employer's plan fell apart. And they quickly had to go back to the bargaining table. So I think CUPE really scored, I agree with Lori, it certainly scored one for working people. But I think in the long term, it actually recognized that workers have rights to withdraw their labor when they feel they're not being treated fairly. And to undermine that is a problem. And I think it's a real problem and has been for a long time. And I think CUPE deserves a lot of respect for standing up to that unfair legislative means.
What kind of precedent, Charles, do you think that doing that set?
It's hard to know. So this is not the first time that Canadian unions have avoided legal pressure to end legitimate or legal strike. We saw it in the 80s. We've seen it multiple times. Grace Hartman did it in Ontario. Jean-Claude Perrault for Cup W in the early 1980s. So it's hard to put it in historical context when it's so fresh. But I do think it actually means that the federal government is going to have to think twice before they use this backdoor approach to end a workers' legal strike. In the long term, it's hard to know. We're still waiting for the results of the ratification vote from CUPE members, which I actually think might actually be struck down, but that's a longer conversation. But nevertheless, I think it actually does mean that the government is going to have to think twice before just unilaterally ending the right of workers to strike, because at the end of the day, I think what's clear is the employer thought that they were going to be able to have their way because the government would side with them. And when governments do that, that's not a free and fair collective bargaining process. It's quite the opposite. So I think it's actually brought some level of a semblance of fairness back to the process. And CUPE should be, I think, rewarded for that.
Lori, you're nodding along. What are you thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. While this was going on and the CUPE members were being ordered back to work, the Canadian Labour Congress held an emergency Canadian Council meeting of all the leaders of unions across the country, and there was unanimous support for CUPE across all unions across the country. So workers were ready to stand up with CUPE to defy this order. And I think it was one of those moments in labor history that we're all going to remember that, yes, this is our time. And, I think we're feeling much more empowered. Workers are feeling united. And I think there's a confidence now with so many people either at the bargaining table or, there's people on the picket line right now that are just coming off some bad agreements that have a renewed confidence that the next time they go to the bargaining table or while they're at the bargaining table, there's going to be support for them to maybe take further action. So I really do believe that this was a win for working people, regardless of what happens with the ratification vote.
At the same time, people, of course, were very inconvenienced. That's, I suppose, the whole point of a strike. But Lori, who do you think won in the court of public opinion in this Air Canada strike?
I think the flight attendants won. I think once, their campaign had been ongoing for some time about their unpaid work. Unpaid work doesn't fly. People didn't realize that. The members of the public that I've talked to, family members and friends, that had no idea of what happens before people board a flight, that these people, the workers are there, are basically volunteering their time to make sure that their flight is safe and that everything that happens before and after boarding is taken care of, that, these workers are doing it on their own time. That is fundamentally unfair. Nobody expects that other people are not getting paid for the work that they're doing. So I think that, sure, there's been frustration with airline travel for a long time, and especially the last 5 years or so. But, I think this is one time where people thought, okay, maybe this is a hit we're willing to take. These workers deserve better.
I'm curious what our listeners have to think of who won in the court of public opinion when it comes to the strike that we just saw with Air Canada. We would love to hear from you. Do you agree? Do you disagree? You can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. We'd also love to hear your experience with unions. Have you ever joined one? Do you think that your workplace might benefit from a union, or maybe not? Again, you can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc. And also, if you have questions for our very smart guests on the show today, you can ask those questions as well. Charles, you were talking about Section 107. This isn't the first time, as you said, that the government has invoked this. Can you think of some other times that the government has forced workers back to work?
Well, at the federal level, we've seen Cup W get forced back. The Teamsters have been forced back, so the railway workers. Cup W seems to be very much in the sort of crosshairs of this government. They've been struggling in a Crown corporation that itself has been struggling and making decisions that have really affected not just the quality of service, but workers' ability to do their jobs. Airline attendants, airline mechanics. We've seen it in all of these different areas. So the federal government's only responsible for a small portion of the labor force with regards to its jurisdiction, but its transportation is one of them. And of course, we've also seen it at the ports. So in all those areas, we've seen back to work legislation or Section 107 being used in this sort of kind of creative way, which I think Lori's right. I think it's going to be really hard for a government to use it again without expecting similar responses from a union, especially when they're on legal strike. I mean, it's hard to strike in Canada. You have to go through a long process of bargaining. You can only strike at the end of a collective agreement. Usually most jurisdictions have cooling off periods and mandatory conciliation. All of those things have to be met before you can actually hit the picket line. You have to have strike votes. I mean, it's not an easy thing. So when governments make unions go through all that process and then take it away in the last minute because it's inconvenience politically for them or because they're feeling political pressure from the opposition or from the public, and in Canada, 30% of the unionized of the labor market is unionized, but a high percentage of that, so almost 75% of it, is in the public sector. So strikes do end up impacting the public in those ways, which is why they engage in these campaigns, as Lori said, to sort of inform the public about the importance of their work. But at the end of the day, if they take that away, then it shifts the balance to the employer in such an unfair way. And I think Canadians can see that and respond to it accordingly.
And just to clarify, Cup W, that's the Canada Post Union, is that correct?
The Canadian Union of Postal Workers.
Of course, Canada Post negotiations over their new collective agreement, they've been going on for more than a year and a half now, I believe. I think it's probably fair to say that most people don't even know where they're at. Every time I send a letter, I'm like, is it going to make it? I don't really know what's going on. What's the latest?
So I don't know the latest,
sure.
but here's what I would say is that Cup W has been going through this since at least the Stephen Harper years, if not earlier.
Okay.
And what happens is when these unionized workers actually go through the process of engaging in a legal strike and then get legislated back, what the government is doing is kicking the can down the road of the issues that workers are facing. So be it health and safety for rural postal workers, be it wages at the bargaining table, be it forms of alternative ways that the post office can run its business, because we all know they're in a fiscal crisis. And what the government keeps doing is kicking the can down the road when it intervenes in this manner. And a lot of these issues have never actually been resolved. So it just keeps kicking the can down the road, and the government keeps intervening, and the problems themselves never get solved. Now, we can have debates about the merits of arbitration or binding arbitration. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it does take the workers' immediate voice out of the process. when governments intervene in this way, and that can be a problem too long term. So I think what we're seeing in terms of CUPW and others is, or the Postal Service, is we're seeing a culmination of decades of governments who have eroded the free and fair collective bargaining process, and I think we're living with the results.
Well, there have been some high-profile strikes lately. Today on the show, we are talking about what this and other job actions mean for the current labor movement. If you have ever been on strike, I want to hear about what it was like for you. Do you have experience with a union or trying to unionize? You can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. And we were, of course, talking about the Air Canada flight attendants strike that came to a conclusion recently. We got some emails from some folks who are supportive of the flight attendants. Judy said, I and the many I've spoken with about the unpaid work of airline workers were shocked to learn about that and also supported their action. Thanks so much for emailing, Judy. And Michael emails, 100% behind the stewardesses, appalling that they were expected to volunteer, in quotations, their time, pay long overdue, and should be retroactive pay. Fair enough. Thank you very much for emailing, Michael. And again, you can get in touch, bluesky@cbc.ca, or give us a call, 1-800-716-2221. We'll get back to the conversation with our experts today. Professor Charles Smith and Federation of Labor President Laurie Jobe are here. Laurie, in Saskatchewan, I think healthcare, education was a big one. Healthcare has been a big one. Healthcare workers have been declared essential workers, though. So how does that affect their ability to bargain?
Well, it obviously makes it very difficult for healthcare unions to go on strike. They have to bargain essential services agreement beforehand. Plus, I think the government's declared almost every healthcare worker in the province essential. So if a union does get to the point where they can actually walk off the job, there'd be very few bodies there that actually belong to the union that would be on strike. So there's a lot of barriers that have been put in place by the provincial government. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done there.
And healthcare unions are bargaining right now. Is that right, Laurie?
Absolutely. Every healthcare union in our province is at the bargaining table right now. Each one of them has reported that there's very little progress and it's very, very slow. And I think it's sort of the same sort of thing that we see at many public service workers across the country. There's a lot of stalling happening by employers, by the people that are at the bargaining table representing the government. So it's taking a long time. It's taking much longer than it should to make any progress. And so it's frustrating. It's frustrating for the folks at the table. It's frustrating for the workers. And it's absolutely frustrating for the public when they're not seeing, anything come of what's happening with our public services, especially healthcare in our province.
Charles, just to come in after that, how do you balance the constitutional right to strike with the needs of the public, especially when it comes to something like healthcare?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Candace, but it's a really hard one to answer. One of the reasons there is a constitutional right to strike, as Laurie and others know, is because the provincial government of Brad Wall in 2007 brought in some pretty draconian legislation on essential services that basically took away the right of almost every public sector worker in the province to strike. And that was struck down, and the Sask Party amended it with the current essential service formula that Laurie just talked about. So now the government, I think, claims that formula works and that's the right balance. But the problem with essential services designation, because it sounds good, right? It sounds like that means that certain workers are so essential to the running of a certain service that if they were to strike, it would put the public in danger. The problem is trying to find the balance between the ability of those workers to actually make progress at the bargaining table. And what the essential services agreements do when you have to bargain them is it means it delays the process even more. So I said earlier how hard it is to go on strike in Canada. Well, this essential service legislation makes it even harder for bargaining to take place in a speedy manner. So we end up seeing this process of 2 or 3 or 4 years of bargaining after the collective agreements expired, and that really leads to discontent among the workers, and it can lead to a lot of animosity. So I'm not convinced the province has got this right. I think in many ways it's had bureaucratic layers that make bargaining more difficult to do. Saskatchewan got around dozens of years without essential services agreements because workers themselves understand their responsibility, and that's often ignored in the conversation. These workers know how important they are, and they don't take that lightly. As Laurie could talk talk in way more detail. I know her background's in healthcare. But I think the government's heavy-handed approach has not helped here, and it's one of the reasons we're seeing what Lori was talking about, in my view.
When would it be appropriate, Charles, for government to order workers back to work, or is the answer never, in your opinion?
Well, that's a really good. It's another really good question. I think that too often we take when we have this conversation, we take the voices of workers out of the process. We assume that workers, especially in the public sector, there's this public perception, and I think media plays a role in this too. Although I'm not going to say that media are all wrong in this, but they definitely focus on strikes more than they do in the day-to-day, because of course that's the sensational sort of story, right? But I think too often governments want to solve political problems when workers go on strike, and the way to do that is to bring down the heavy hand of legislation, rather than actually say, like, how can we hear what workers have to say? I mean, don't forget, unions are democratic organizations. I mean, it's not perfect, but they're more democratic than almost any other institution in civil society. Their leaders are elected on a regular basis. They take strike votes. They have to by legislation. They vote on collective agreements. Like, that's a more democratic process than probably any other civil society organization in the same situation. So when governments come in, they're saying all of that inter-union democracy is not as important as solving a political problem for us. And that doesn't mean that workers' strikes could be really dangerous to the public. But again, that balance has never really been discussed in a serious way. I think sometimes it's done in a draconian way. It's done sometimes by governments that I think in their DNA are somewhat hostile to workers' collective organizations. It's usually done by political parties on the right, not in the center and on the left. And there's reasons for that. So I think when we look at it holistically, we probably haven't got the balance right, because we're dealing with legislation that's been passed by governments that are kind of hostile to unions' collective rights to begin with.
Lori, I see some gentle nodding there. What are you thinking about?
Well, I absolutely agree with what Charles, when he mentioned about workers' voices and having workers at the table. There's a long history of that pre-essential service legislation. And he also mentioned that I'm a healthcare worker. And as my time as a healthcare worker, I was on strike once, and it was for 7 days. But I'll tell you what, there was an essential service plan put in place that was agreed upon by the union and the workers and the employer that made sure that everybody was safe. There was not an incident at the time when we were on strike. Like, everybody made sure that the people that needed the care got the care. But we were still able to hold a picket line, like folks that worked, in many of the departments in healthcare institutions were able to walk the picket line. We now see that people that work in the Starbucks in a hospital are declared essential. Like, those kinds of things are completely unfair and absolutely just not right. So we need to bring workers' voices back to the table. There's been a call for that for a very long time. There was a promise of that, but we haven't really seen any fruits of that. But I think that if you can bring workers to the table, the solutions are there to be found. Often we see like closures in rural Saskatchewan of emergent care situations or even any kind of care, and they have to close because they don't have the staff. Today we hear an announcement about the urgent care center opening in Saskatchewan and that 24/7 is no longer a priority. Well, let's just be clear about that. 24/7 is no longer an option because the recruitment and retention of healthcare workers in this province has failed. And that's something that needs to get addressed before anything can move, before we can actually see some improvement for our healthcare facilities, for healthcare workers, and for the public. There needs to be a way to bring people back to take pride in their job and to recruit new people to come into healthcare, because that's one of the biggest problems we're seeing right now.
Lori, how long ago did you experience that strike?
Well, I'm just thinking, I remember it was during my 40th birthday, so it was more than 20 years ago.
What was that period? Like, what do you remember from that time? I don't think most people probably, I don't know if that's fair to say, maybe you guys know the stats, but like, I'm guessing most people haven't been on a strike. So what was that like firsthand?
It was an incredible experience in terms of bringing the workforce together. There was, I was a CUPE member at that time. The solidarity was it was palatable. You could feel it. Everybody was so excited, and that was actually at a period where we won medical benefits for healthcare workers. So like it was really an impressive time, and it was an effective strike. And like I said, we supported when the nurses were on strike. Our union was there to support them. The other unions were there to support us when we were on strike. And It's not something that happens very often, but when it does, it's something that happens for a very good reason, and that has been taken away from working people right now, and we need to find a way to get it back.
I want to bring another guest into the conversation right now. Marilyn McFarlane is with UFCW, which is the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, Local 1400. Their union represents workers at Heritage Inn Hotel in Saskatoon and Moose Jaw, and they've been locked out for nearly 2 years. She is in our Regina studio to tell us more. Hi there, Marilyn.
Hello.
For people who are outside Saskatoon and Moose Jaw, they might not have seen the picket lines. Can you give us some background? When did workers get locked out, and what is this labor dispute about?
Well, the reality is that they will have been locked out 2 years on the 7th of September. And at the end of the day, it boils down to this employer wants to take away and erode any of the advantages of being a unionized worker and make it where you're just barely making minimums in your workplace.
How many employees are taking part in this?
So between the two picket lines, we have on average about 15 people between the two lines. We do have a number that have gone and found other jobs elsewhere because some of these workers were working in the hotel and the catering and those types of departments part-time already. So they did have other full-time jobs. But we do have a steady number that are on the lockout line every week, and they are there holding the line for the workers, trying to get better working conditions for all of the people working there.
And are they still getting strike pay, Marilyn?
We do pay them strike pay through UFCW Local 1400. So between the local and the national UFCW benefits and international, so yes, they are getting strike pay.
You mentioned that some people have decided to find other jobs, which I think most people can agree is fair enough for them. What has this been like for the workers?
Well, I mean, it's one thing. I always say it's one thing to be on a picket line because you're there, right, thinking that at the end of the day, your employer and you just aren't able to come to an agreement at the bargaining table. But we have to make sure people understand that being locked out of your workplace is it is different than being on strike. This employer has, at the end of the day, decided that they just don't want to sit down and negotiate with the union in trying to come to a solution that can work for both parties. This employer is very much taking the stance that because they've locked the workers out, that unless the employer and the union, unless the union agrees with the document that the employer has put forward, that's what they want. And it's not about trying to come to a collective deal. It's not about trying to negotiate gives and takes, which bargaining should be about. It's solely based on this is what we want, and we're not going to sit down with you, and we're not going to do anything until we get what we want.
Is there an end in sight?
I wish I could say there was. I do know that today they're actually sitting down with the help of a conciliator that's been appointed by the government to try to come to some type of an end. But I will be honest with you, at this particular moment, there is no end in sight. And with the help of the community and other unions, both in Saskatoon and Moose Jaw and surrounding area, all the affiliates that belong to the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour. They're helping keep the morale up on the line and just making sure that at this particular moment it ends up being where you just have to last one more day.
What is that morale like, though? What have you heard about, I imagine, the emotional toll that this would be taking on workers? I have to be upfront here and go, it's very stressful for the workers to sit there and know that all you're trying to do is get a fair, negotiated collective agreement to maintain the basic things that, as a worker, you should be entitled to. Paid benefits, paid bereavement leave, scheduling based on your seniority, how long you've worked in the hotel. To us, those are basic rights that being a union member that you bargain for and you pay union dues for. And
So there are days where it's people are happy because people come out and support them, and I won't say there hasn't been days where there's been tears and lots of frustration by these workers as well.
What do you think it'll take to get back to the bargaining table?
I think right now at this particular moment, it would be nice to have something put forward from the Saskatchewan Labour Board. There's been lots of things brought up, unfair labour practices, all sorts of different legal matters that are going forward. And it would just be nice for the Labour Board to stand up and say, look, we need to find a solution for a lockout line for people who have been out here, again, just shy of 2 years. And we believe that the Labour Board, Saskatchewan Labour Board, has that ability. And we just want somebody to stand up and, quite honestly, do the right thing for these workers.
Marilyn, I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marilyn McFarland is with UFCW Local 1400. They represent workers at Heritage Inn in Moose Jaw and in Saskatoon. We are talking about labor and job action today on the show. We'd love for you to weigh in. There's still time to do that. You can give us a call, 1-800-716-2221, or email bluesky@cbc.ca. We have two labor experts with us today. Professor Charles Smith and Laurie Jobe from the Federation of Labor are here. Charles, almost 2 years, just a few days away from 2 years, Marilyn was mentioning. What are some of the longest job actions in Saskatchewan, off the top of your head?
I know there was a grocery strike, I think RWDSU waged in rural Saskatchewan that lasted 2 or 3 years, maybe longer. I stand corrected. This wouldn't be the longest, but just listening to those stories and just think about how grueling it must be to continue to go to a picket line, because picket lines, they really do wear you down. Not just from personal experience, but from reading about strikes throughout history. I mean, these are the kind of things that workers really don't take lightly, especially on a lockout situation. But I also think that the stories that Marilyn was talking about do reflect some of the distinctions between, public and private sector disputes. So, for instance, the Dalhousie administration at the university in Nova Scotia just recently announced they're locking out their faculty. It's made news across the country. It would be really, I think, unconceivable or non-conceivable, or it would be hard to imagine that lasting 2 years because of the number of people affected versus this small workplace in the private sector where we don't get the same coverage and the same discussion. It does reflect the differences, right? So in the private sector, these disputes can fly under the public radar in a way that the public sector disputes don't. And I think that's one of the problems these days, is that the majority of unionized workers in Canada are in the public sector, and a smaller and smaller percentage, I think it's around 10% now, are in the private sector. So one of the biggest challenges for labor unions is to reach out and build its movement in that sector so that it has more people to rely on. That's a real struggle, and we've been seeing that decline since the 1980s. And smaller workplaces, our labor system doesn't do well in small workplaces like, say, Tim Hortons or small mom-and-pop restaurants or whatever in the service sector. There's also a lot of flexibility to defeat union drives in the labor codes across the country by employers. So there's all kinds of issues, I think, in reaching out to that. But that speaks to some of the problems in our current system.
We do have a caller on the line right now. Cheryl is in Regina. Hi, Cheryl.
Hello.
What are you thinking about?
My question is just the story about the lockout made me think of this question. I'm wondering if Charles or Laurie could comment on whether or not they've seen a trend. To me, it seems to me like there's been an increase in the number of lockouts by employers versus like 20 years ago. So I was wondering if that there is a trend that they can comment on, but also is the increasing use of lockouts just a bargaining strategy of employers where they just think that they're going to get what they want at the bargaining table if they do this, or is it to break the union?
Those are really good questions. Laurie, what are you thinking?
Thanks for that question. It's a great question. I think that there are situations where the lockout is threatened solely to break the union. I think that in the case of the workers at the Heritage Inn in Moose Jaw, Saskatoon, that was the intent by the employers to get rid of the union so that the workers didn't have any rights or perceived not to have any rights. I think that And I'm not sure about the question about whether lockouts are happening more now than they were before. I'm sure Charles would be able to answer that better than I. But one thing I'd like to comment on is that, and we're seeing, like Manitoba recently enacted this in BC, and now there's federal legislation around replacement workers. And I think that, or anti-scab legislation, and I think that that's something that would put an end to those kinds of conversations. I think that, for example, at the Heritage Inn, if they were not able to bring in replacement workers, there would not be in the situation they're in right now. They would be happy to go to the bargaining table and to hammer out a collective agreement that was fair for the workers and, obviously it's a joint agreement, so the employer could live with it as well. But unfortunately, with the ability to just, lock the workers out and bring in other workers, we've seen it at the upgrader in Regina here, where they locked out the workers at the refinery, and the dangers that not only does that put the workers that are existing there, but the community and drains the resources of the unions. So there's a lot of things to that conversation. But yeah, I'd like to hear from Charles a little bit if he knows a little bit more about the
more lockouts.
It's hard to answer that question to specifically because Stats Canada, which is the main data source for strikes and lockouts in the Labour Department at the federal level, doesn't actually distinguish between strikes or lockouts. They just call it strikes or lockouts. So in the data set, it's hard for us to know. Here's what we can say, though. So right after COVID, and I think the COVID pandemic was sort of winding down, we did see a dramatic increase in strike action by workers in Canada. That's clear. The data is very clear on that. And one of the reasons was because we had a period of high inflation. Now, it's not a perfect correlation between periods of high inflation and increased worker militancy, but it actually we can make a distinction that does happen. So we saw it in the 1980s when inflation was extremely high, and we saw it right post-COVID when inflation kicked off to about 8 or 9%. We definitely saw that. We saw more workers rejecting contracts that were bargained because they didn't meet the cost of living. As those pressures have eased, we've seen employers take the offensive a little more. So anecdotally, we can say we are seeing lockout tools being used more aggressively. Now, I wonder if that's a correction from what we saw post-COVID. So I think we can say anecdotally it does seem that way, but it's hard to sort of, I think, put it down into the data. Certainly in the case of Air Canada, which we talked about, I think that what they've said publicly post-strike is that absolutely the employer was looking to make gains at the expense of a contract that had expired after 10 years. And we're hoping for the government intervention to meet that gain. So I think we're seeing employers trying to push back a little bit about some of the gains we saw post-COVID. So the data set's unclear, but it does seem anecdotally that is occurring.
Cheryl, if you are still there, thank you so much for those really, really interesting questions. I do want to kind of zoom out for a moment. We know that the wealth gap in this country and in other countries as well, it's incredibly wide. What responsibility do you think unions have to try and close that gap, Lori?
Well, I think that especially like in the recent past, the last, even since COVID or maybe a little bit before, wages are stagnant. We really have to make sure that it can't be the first thing that we're talking about when we're bargaining a collective agreement is that we need higher wages, but it's absolutely part of the conversation. It needs to be part of the conversation. We've long said, like through our office, and my message has always been, we don't have a worker shortage. We have a wage shortage. And I think that that's part of the problems that we're seeing is that economically workers are suffering. They're not being able to make ends meet. You can have a good full-time job with benefits and still struggling day to day. And there's so many things that come into play when we're talking about that, whether it's hard to find affordable housing, affordable childcare. Everything is going up. Well, our wages are staying stagnant. So I'm not exactly sure if that answers your question, but I think that that's a big part of it, that workers need to see improved wages.
Charles, what are your thoughts on unions' responsibilities to try and close some of those wage gaps?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Sorry, I've said that a lot because you've been asking really good questions, Candace. But I think there's two ways in a capitalist society that wealth gets redistributed. Either it's through taxation and social programs, or it's through workers gaining more of the surplus that their labor produces than is taken by the employer. So the more we see workers in unions, the more we see wages being more distributed to workers in terms of higher wages. So in Canada, as of 2024, the last data I saw, there's about 11% union wage advantage. So if you're in a union, you're likely to make 11% more.
Wow.
We know that there are gender wage gaps in society. If you're in a union, that wage gap is much lower. So we know that the more workers are in a union, the more likely they are to get paid more and to be paid more fairly. So, if you think that's a good thing, then it means, I think ipso facto, that more workers in a union means you're going to have a lesser wage gap between those who have the most and those who have the least. Now, there's all kinds of ways to measure class in society, the class distinction between workers, and there's no perfect way. Wages are one way, education's another. One data point that stuck out for me in a recent article I published was that if you have a high school degree or less, you are least likely to be in a union in Canada right now, which means that those people who are working in, working class jobs are least likely to be in a union. Those who have the highest degrees of education, so post-secondary or more, so the most highly trained workers, are most likely in Canada to be in a union. So those who need it the most are least likely to be in a union, which means that data alone to me suggests that there's real problems with regards to getting more of that in terms of wage, more of that surplus in terms of wages. So I think a public good if we care about equality is to have more workers in unions.
Interesting. Lori, what do you see as the biggest labor fights on the horizon in this province?
Well, I think that there's a lot, especially with so much of our public sector at the bargaining table right now. I think that that's one of the big things is like to be able to walk away and achieve a collective agreement that is fair, that might see a decent wage increase. And I was just thinking about some of the things that Charles said about how the lowest wage earners are the ones that are least likely to be in a union. And I think that's another thing that is a result of what happened early in the mandate of the Sask Party government is when they stripped away the Trade Union Act and it made it much harder to join unions. So there's that. We're seeing, and I'm just hearing anecdotally about how a group will go to the Labour Board for a union certification, and it takes a very, very long time to see that. But I'll tell you what, if there's a group that goes there to decertify, it's happening overnight. So there's a lot of things that are happening behind closed doors that I think that we need to start talking about, we need to start looking into. And education, we need to be able to show people, groups, especially the ones that are looking to join a union, about the most effective way that can happen. And, we're looking at that internally as well as about how we can educate folks, because we do get calls, often about the desire to join a union and what's the best possible way to do that. And so we're, trying to advise them without,
Yeah. There's so much more to say, and I have so many more questions that I might ask you guys after the show, but that is all the time that we have today. So thank you so much, Lori.
Thanks, Charles. And thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Charles.
Yeah.
Thanks, Candace.
Lori Jobe is the president of the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor, and Charles Smith teaches politics at St. Thomas More College at the U of S. He's also an expert in labor issues. I'm Candace Lipsky. Thanks so much for tuning in to Blue Sky